Hello and welcome to your very first sewing lesson. Today we're going to be talking about all the tools that you need to be successful sewing. If you feel like you have a good grasp on this concept, you can go ahead and skip it. If you feel like you'd like a little more information and tips and tricks along the way, go ahead and stay tuned, and I'm going to go through all the different sewing tools and the best practices on how to use them. There's also a PDF file that will have lots of resources in there if you need any help. And again, I'm here if you have any questions. So let's go ahead and get started. So here I have an overview of all my sewing tools that I use, and I'm going to go ahead and go through each one individually. The first tool that I want to talk about are scissors, and I have actually 3 different pair that I use very frequently in my sewing room. The first is for paper only. So this is for cutting out PDF patterns, using for other craft projects. These are my craft scissors. I do not use these on fabric. And then I have a large pair of scissors that I use to cut fabric only. So no one else uses these scissors. They belong in the sewing room and they only cut fabric. And these are great if you're like cutting down a seam, clipping corners, that kind of thing. These large scissors are perfect for that, or cutting out patterns. These will be great for that. I also have a small pair of scissors, and these have a very fine point. You can see they have a very fine point, and these are great for like trimming threads that come out of your machine, trimming down the fabric, threads. They have a very fine point, and sometimes if you need to pick out a seam, these are great. So I have all of these scissors. If you can only afford to start with 1 pair, I would recommend getting a small pair or a large pair, because you can use these as a seam ripper in a bind. So the next tools we're going to talk about sort of all at once are marking tools, and these pens are absolutely amazing. And we're also going to talk about an iron. You have to have a high quality iron, and if you don't have a decalcification setting, you have to use distilled water. Otherwise you get like these white dots on the inside of your iron, and you'll have to clean it, and it can put it on the fabric and mess it up. So I want to show you these marking pens. They are pretty amazing. So let's say I was just going to mark a corner for the bag. Let me show you this. So I was just going to mark it, and then you have like these huge pen marks. Hope you can see that on the camera. These pen marks on your fabric. Well, let's say you stitch it and then you want the lines to go away. You just simply heat them, and it is like magic. They just completely disappear. So these pens, I highly, highly recommend these, and these are in the resources list. So continuing, we talked about the iron. This one's cordless, which I absolutely love. And again, this one's in the resource notes, and it doesn't get too hot, which is also good for most sewing projects. So most people will have an iron. This is a larger purchase item. If you don't have one, become familiar with it if you haven't ironed clothes very much. But it is an essential tool in your sewing arsenal for sure. This is a tabletop ironing board that I love. It is perfect. It's portable. You can move it. You can take it in and out as needed. It's perfect for most projects. Sewing seams, you don't have to walk around a huge board or get that out. I found this at Target for $15, and I'll have this linked out. Absolutely love it. I cannot recommend it enough. All right, so moving right along, I'm going to show you now how to use the seam gauge. And the seam gauge, you'll notice, has both metric and empirical measurements. And I'm in the US, so I use empirical measurements. So let's say you want to do a hem that's a 1/2 inch. So how do you use this? So what you're going to do is you're going to fold the fabric under, and then you're going to line up the little slider part with the raw edge, and then you're going to put this edge on the fold. So you just get it to where it's straight, and then you go ahead and press it. And let's say you're like, you know, I messed it up a little here. You can pull it forward and keep straightening it until you have a nice straight line. And this fabric's doubled, which you wouldn't ever do a hem like this. I'm just trying to show you. Let's see. It would look more like this. So you would have this nice edge that you would then stitch. So that's how you use the seam gauge. And moving right along, I have this seam in here. Let me show you how to use your seam ripper. And your seam ripper will come with just about every sewing machine will have a seam ripper that's included. It comes apart like this, and then you can put this in the back so it's easy to hold. This little dot is really nice. This keeps you from ripping the fabric. So when you go to open the seam, I'm gonna try to do this backwards so you guys can see. You want to have the ball of the seam ripper in the seam this way, so that when you're pushing through, this sharp edge will rip fabric, but this will slide through a little bit easier, and then you just push. I'm sorry, it's a little hard to do it backwards, but you just kind of push through the seam and it'll rip the seam out. I usually do it this way towards me, so it's a lot harder to do it showing it in the camera. So you would orient it towards yourself with the ball down, and then this sharp edge up so that it's not digging into the fabric, and then you would slide it across and it pulls it right out. So this usually comes with most sewing machines. It's very handy to have. I think I have 3 or 4 of them. Unfortunately, you will definitely need one of these. You can also use the sharp edge if you want to pick out a stitch this way. You can also do that as well. Another thing that's really nice to have is a trash can handy. So this one sits right underneath my sewing table, and then as you know, I make a mess, I can just swipe it right into the trash. And then I also have a paper recycling bin as well. I do a lot of pattern making and PDF pattern testing, so I print a lot of paper, and then so I have that separate for recycling. But those are really nice to have close by. You definitely want a trash can. All right, another tool that I'd like to talk about are sewing pins. And this is a pin cushion that I wear on my wrist. This is really, really nice when sewing, that you have access to your pins as you walk around the room. Because what happens is you'll pin the fabric here and iron it, and then walk to your sewing machine, and then you'll be taking the pins out as you sew, and then they'll wind up at the machine, and then you'll need them in another spot. So if they walk around with you, you always have them at the ready. So I have my regular straight pins that are for woven, and I also have a knit pins, and these are ballpoints, and so they're blunted and they won't pick the fabric. These are really sharp. So this is for your woven, and these are for knits. Most people start off sewing woven fabric, so we can stick to these pins for most of the projects. But if you get into knit sewing, it's good to invest in these ballpoint pins. Another thing that I forgot to mention when we were talking about scissors is I have seen videos of people wearing their scissors on retractable lanyards that you see like in the hospital staff when you have to buzz into a doorway or have access, and then it retracts back. And I thought, this is a great idea. You should put your scissors on a retractable device, and then they're always at your hip. Just be careful, obviously, when you sit down or put them up here, you know, that you don't accidentally stab yourself with scissors. But I was like, that is a really cool idea. So I thought I'd share that with you guys. Okay, so staying on the same sort of theme, I also have a bunch of different sewing machine needles. And I'm going to talk more about sewing machine needles in another lesson, and you know which ones to use for which projects and how to change it in the machine. But it's nice to have a lot of extra needles. They do break, and you need to change them at least every 10 hours of sewing. And what I do is every time I start a new project, I just go ahead and sew a needle, change the needle. And that usually keeps it from skipping stitches or breaking the thread or needle breakage. A lot of people forget to change their needle when they're first sewing, and then their sewing starts coming out not so great. The stitches aren't looking good, the tension isn't right, they can't adjust it, and they can't figure out why. And it's because the needle hasn't been changed. So you want to have lots of needles on hand. They're not super expensive. Most sewing machines will come with a variety pack when you first purchase the machine, but these can be purchased. And again, these resources are in the additional information packet. Another thing that you definitely will need to have is sewing thread. For all of our projects that we are going to use or are going to sew, just 100% general purpose, 100% polyester general purpose thread is perfect. Gutermann is my favorite. I love this brand so much. They make a really good high quality thread. And you generally, for most sewing projects, white or black is all you need. You can see I buy these in 500 yards. It's also good to have one neutral color, and then that's pretty much all you need, unless you're going to be doing a lot of decorative top stitching, which sometimes I do. So I have lots of thread, and you will collect lots of thread. And I'm going to talk more about different threads and their usage in another lesson. Another cool thing that I want to show you about Gutermann thread is that it does have this little secret pocket in here that comes out, and you can actually put needles in there, and then this, you can take this with you, and this can be like a on-the-go sewing kit. Also, I don't know, if you have like a tail and they hang down and they make a mess, you can actually thread it back through this little opening and it keeps it secure. And if you can't find it, if it's really in there, you can just turn it and it pops right out for you to grab. So that's a really cool feature from Gutermann thread that I love. And this, of course, is my favorite brand of thread. I don't have a lot of experience with other ones because this is what I use exclusively. Last but certainly not least, and probably one of the most important tools that you will have in your sewing arsenal is a self-healing mat, a grid ruler, and a rotary cutter. This rotary cutter is for right-handed people, but they do make left-handed or ambidextrous. So if you're left-handed, using a right-handed one is not ideal. Make sure that you get a left-handed rotary cutter. The self-healing mat, you should get the biggest size that you have space for, especially if you ever get into women's or any sort of garment sewing where you're cutting pants, you need that long space. Because you can use your rotary cutter to cut out pattern pieces and fabric, and you will want a big mat, the biggest you can get. Another thing, if you have limited storage, is to get a big mat, have a piece of plywood cut at the hardwood store, just duct tape it down, and then you can slide it under a bed when it's not in use, or you can, stand it up somewhere in your garage. But you don't want to put it anywhere where it can be subject to high heat or, variable temperatures. You really want like an ambient temperature because heat will warp it. The cold can make it brittle. You want to take care of this mat because it will last a lifetime. You also want to change these rotary cutter blades whenever they become dull, and you'll notice that it just doesn't cut through the fabric like it should. And the blade is getting dull. This is actually my grandmother's, and it's over 20 years old at least. I inherited that from her, so I don't even know if Frisker still makes this exact one, but I have literally been using it for that long. They used to not make these, and this was the first one that they came out with, and my grandmother bought it, and it was life-changing. So let me show you how to sort of use it. If you're using a grid ruler, the mat, so let's say you have a piece of fabric and I want to cut a 2-inch strip. So you're going to use use these lines here to line up the fabric, and I want to line it up here because I'm going to cut a 2-inch strip, and each one of these squares is 1 inch. So I'm going to cut a 2-inch strip. So what I'm going to do is make sure this is nice and lined up, and then I'm going to put my grid ruler, and you can line it up again using these lines, and then you want to line it up with these lines to make sure you have everything nice and square. Another thing is the rotary blade is incredibly sharp, especially if it's brand new. So when you're pulling the blade towards you, your leg is there at the end of the table. Be sure you don't keep swiping, you will cut your leg. And I've certainly cut my fingers with the rotary cutter. So this is a safety issue. You need to be really careful. You also need to get in the habit of, as you push this forward and the blade is exposed, when you're done, push the button and retract it. Get in the habit of doing that and not leaving it open on the cutting table, because it's just, you're asking to get cut. Believe me, I've done it. So let me be a cautionary tale. So now that we have this lined up, you want to put pressure down as close to where you're cutting as possible. Now remember, go slow. You don't need to do it fast. The faster you move, the more likely it is to slip and you can cut your fingers. So pressure down with both hands, because otherwise if you don't put pressure, it'll slip. As you pull it towards you, the ruler will slide and then you won't get a nice cut. So you want to do pressure and pull it through slowly and stop, so you not continue and go and hit your leg. So very slow applied pressure. Retract the blade, and then you have the strip cut, and it's a really nice strip of fabric that's perfectly 2 inches. So that's how you use it, and we'll get more as we are learning how to use patterns and cut. We'll go over this. I also have this little tiny one that I love as well for small projects, like if I was making bags and I need to mark. This one's great for that. But this big grid ruler I use, 90% of the time. This gets so much use, and my mat is absolutely essential. Another thing that I haven't talked about yet that I thought I should mention are pattern weights. And pattern weights I really love to use for pattern pieces when I'm cutting out the pieces instead of pinning it. This is something that I've started new, and I've actually made these. Anything heavy can be a pattern weight. It doesn't have to be one that's purchased from a store. I made these. You can use ceramic tile. Anything that has some weight to it will keep the pattern in place is perfectly fine. So I use these when I'm cutting out patterns instead of pins. So that may be something else that you want to get. Again, a heavy can of soup is a pattern weight. You don't have to spend money on these, and it's nice to have.